So I have an embarrassing confession. When I recorded this interview with Tad Stones, I think I had the settings wrong. Everything on his end was recorded, but none of my audio was. Now thankfully we have the most important part, everything Mr. Stone said, but since I was essentially muted, I have re-recorded the gist of what my questions were. As a result, this might sound a little off, but I hope you're still able to enjoy it and learn some new things about Darkwing Duck.
I just watched a little of the Rescue Rangers thing. Fat Cat was based on Sidney Greenstreet, who was the classic villain in The Maltese Falcon and a lot of the crime movies of that time with Humphrey Bogart. So it was, even though I used to share an office with Ron Clemens, who co-wrote The Great Mouse Detective. He was not based on Rattigan in any way, other than all villains of a certain ilk have the same mannerisms. So Darkwing, yes, started out as Double O Duck.
Was Steelbeak intended to be the biggest villain on the show?
Steelbeak was not. He was specifically based on Rob Paulson, who I'd worked with since Gummy Bears. And Rob would kid around in that voice. And I was saying, I'm going to create a character for that voice. And that's how Steelbeak came to be. Once Darkwing lost the name Double O Duck, I felt freed up from the spy stuff, but the spy stuff was still a great source of, not that we use it as much as I thought we would, but a great way of doing international stories. So when you're starting a show, designing a show, you look for, where am I going to get the stories from? You don't want to have a concept that's really funny but turns out to be very limited, and you have trouble coming up with storylines. And although I don't know that we actually said it in the show, in my mind, Shush kind of explained how Darkwing Duck had all those wonderful toys, as Jack Nicholson would say. Who was funding all the devices of Darkwing Duck? In my mind, it was Shush, in the background. Otherwise, notably, Drake Mallard did not move to a stately manner when he adopted Goslin. It was in suburbia next to the Muddlefoots. So he was watching his pennies.
On that subject, did Steelbeak have a backstory of how he got his beak in the first place?
Not going into it. I mean, he was just, the idea of the steel beak was, based on Jaws in the James Bond films, who had a metal mouth and was very strong. And, we put that into an anthropomorphic animal form. A lot of times it was about, again, there's sometimes people pitch shows or characters and you realize that, okay, you spent 90% of the time talking about the backstory. None of that's going to be on the screen. We want to know what the show is like going forward, not what this character used to be like. What's he going to do in episode 4? So a lot of times it was just, you're looking at the surface stuff, the personality quirks, the powers or whatever of a villain. Although some writers might say, oh, I'm going to develop a backstory. We didn't go into a lot of detail that way, because that way, if someone pitched a story where, what if Steelbeak was actually, well, we did it with Megavolt. What if Megavolt went to high school with Darkwing Duck? If you had come up with this ornate backstory for Megavolt that had nothing to do with that, it would be like, oh, we can't tell that story. Although notably, Darkwing was not continuity conscious, and he had several different origins, including the one where he went to the high school with Megavolt. So just in general, in dealing with villains, it was more about what kind of stories can we do going forward, as opposed to locking them into a backstory. I mean, notably, Negaduck was created as a single episode where Darkwing was split in two. And at the end of that, and we worried about whether Jim Cummings could create a character who was the same yet different enough, and how difficult would it be to get overseas to not mix up the two characters that look exactly the same in the storyboard. We were pretty good at that. And at the end of the episode, I told the writers, I want more Negaduck. Let's do more stories with Negaduck. And they said, well, how do we do that? Because every story would be the same. How Darkwing is split in two, to be Posiduck and Negaduck. And I said, no, nobody likes Posiduck. He's not fun. just do Negaduck. And they said, how do we explain how he came back? And I said, you don't. I never wondered how Batman was constantly putting the Joker in prison, and yet he was always out there doing crime sprees with the Riddler and Penguin and all the rest. And that was the Silver Age idea behind Darkwing, because I grew up with Silver Age comics where continuity was not a huge deal at all. And again, it was that whole spirit of keeping things loose enough that we could get all sorts of stories out of it. Now, since the show's been on, fans will go in and like they talk about, well, the real origin of Darkwing is he was in high school with Megavolt. I said, you only think that's the real origin because that's the one you like the most. If we came up with a new one, it doesn't hem us into that. Fans will always create a head canon, and professionals do it too. In the DC universe, they're constantly recreating the universe, and yet the Killing Joke story of Batman and Barbara Gordon being injured and put in a wheelchair always seemed to be in every continuity, whether they've explained it away or whether she's shown being Batgirl again. So to me, that's, since the show's been on the air, that's part of the fun of fandom, is people trying to connect it together, trying to, tie Duckburg into St. Canard and all of that.
One thing I've noticed about the villains in this series is that they are more willing to kill kids. In other shows from this period, you get the feeling that a bad guy might want to pull his punches where that's concerned, but Gosalyn and Honker get in a lot of trouble in most episodes.
Yeah, I mean, that was when you said, I was taken aback when you said kill kids, and I'm going, did we actually kill kids on screen? I don't think so. No, they were just threatened. Yeah, exactly. So that, I mean, to me, that made them villains. The fun of, even Batman 66, as silly as that show was, their cliffhangers was always Batman in some trap that was going to kill him or Robin or both of them. And the fun was seeing how they got out of it, after the commercial break. So we had to have the threat there. When developing Darkwing Duck, an executive said, how can we have jeopardy in this show if a safe can literally fall on Darkwing Duck and the door opens of the safe and he walks out like an accordion as a gag? How can we be afraid for him? And they said, like, for a commercial break, what brings the audience back? And I said, well, Darkwing will react frightened and will play scary music. And that's enough. The jeopardy still works within the show, but you can enjoy any Superman comic book and he's coming back in the next issue, or for that many, any TV series. Doesn't matter how threatening things are in Star Trek, whatever version, basically the cast keeps coming back.
I read that Quackerjack was originally supposed to be a darker character, and that never really played out. Could you elaborate on that?
I mean, he's a lot of people's favorite villain, and the Liquidator is too, for that matter. Both of whom I especially Quackerjack, I saw in a different way. Only that I was thinking of Quackerjack as being like the Joker, and the Joker is, insane and cackling and all that, but he's a real threat. So I kind of, in pitching him and, to everybody, I just saw him. It's a nuanced thing. And then when he was cast, the voice was just sillier. But the point was he was entertaining. And I was, sometimes in my career, I want to look back and say, oh, why wasn't I more picky? Because I certainly worked with other producers who were very picky and changing things and going over budget and taking more time. And I was very much production oriented because that let me get away with stuff. They would say, yeah, Tad runs the show and stay out of his way, kind of thing. So it really was a nuance. He came out sillier in just how he was treated. But the point was he was still entertaining. He was entertaining in a different way. I kind of then pitched Paddywhack as being, okay, here's the scary one. But even he was, very funny, although we could have done more supernatural stories probably with him. So again, there's not a lot to explain other than I thought of him being, it's like Negaduck is a more serious villain. I mean, he's so over the top in how evil he is. It's just I guess, I'm only thinking it through now, that pitch Quackerjack a little more toward that. But ultimately entertainment is the thing, and there was no point in I wasn't going to recast a character who's basically still getting laughs, just in a different way. It's like, okay, let's twist and rethink things, and he worked out great as a team up with Megavolt a lot of time. Two these crazy characters bouncing off each other.
Then there's Bushroot.
Now, Bushroot was based on, a lot of people say, oh, he's based on Poison Ivy. He's not at all. He's or the what's the other Alan Moore one?
Swamp Thing?
No, there was a
Floronic Man?
Floronic Man. I had never knew of him at the time. No, Bushroot is based a little on Swamp Thing, in that Alan Moore played with the idea that his pollen could go out, and that he was part of a large. He was practically immortal. Whereas more specifically, he's based on a villain that may have only been used twice in Strange Tales comics, which was an offshoot of Fantastic Four. It just featured the Human Torch, and the second half of the comic was Doctor Strange. There was a villain called Plant Man, and in his first version, he actually wore a giant hat like Darkwing's and a huge cloak, and that he controlled. I guess it was also in Wizard of Oz for that matter, but he would control a tree or a cactus plant to fling needles, or to, knock a character over, that, just making plants more intelligent, or at least ambulatory. And then when he came back, he had this ridiculous costume that was all these leaves. So it was those two, the idea that we can play with the immortality idea, but certainly, just controlling plants and all of that. Bushwoots is one of my favorite because he's not a one note villain, in that a lot of times he's sympathetic. It's like, the other scientists were picking on him, and he was just trying to impress his girlfriend, kind of thing. And Darkwing kind of kills him at the end, in that he runs over him with a lawnmower, and then we cut back and you see that he's resprouting, and there's a little plant with a duck beak. So he didn't really kill him, but not that Darkwing knew that at the time. Anyway, I thought I have a lot of fun with Bushroot, just because of he was something different and a different personality. Whereas Liquidator is a fan favorite in many ways, but I never warmed up to him, in that he was too one note. He had his powers, certainly, which were not based on Marvel's Hydro Man, because that was the period I was in college. I wasn't collecting comics. He was actually based on early appearances of the Sandman in Amazing Spider-Man #4, I believe, where he would go down a drain as sand particles, and that just stuck with me and just turned it into water. But the one note idea, and maybe it's just because I was not great at doing it, but talking in slogans. A couple of my story editors were fantastic at that. Dwayne Capizzi, I think, was the story editor who really made the most of him and could really come up with dialogue that felt like it was commercial pitches, or something you'd see in a late night commercial. Yeah, I mean, he didn't have to do it all the time. You just have to pepper it through, and that was the saving grace. But he did. It's one of those things where a lot of these characters are saying, wait, you just flooded the city. Wouldn't many people die when you did that? But it's like when Superman or Godzilla stomps through Tokyo, it's rare that they talk about all the people who were in those buildings, as they crumbled.
It's not exciting, but if Darkwing and Bushroot ever just talked, I think they might actually resolve a good deal of their issues. Bushroot comes across as more of a victim sometimes, especially in his first episode.
Yeah, I think, again, that was, to me, that was just the fun storytelling, to make something different, something you didn't expect. I mean, Bushroot's the one character I said, I can see him kind of turning good, but sometimes we team him up with people and he kind of lost that aspect, and I wasn't always on top of it with my writers to kind of guide them back. Don't forget the soft side. But Tino Ansana, who did the voice, was such a great, friendly sound to him. That a more forgiving voice that he couldn't really be that evil, you know. And he was just trying to create his bride, and he ended up with a vampire potato, you know. And he was still one of the where Darkwing just said, "You are evil," you know, and Darkwing half the time he was in the wrong, where Darkwing would have a flaw that we would play throughout the episode, and our not that we followed it religiously, but kind of the rule of the show was if Darkwing has something to learn, he's going to be failing even on things that it's unconnected with that flaw. Once he learns his lesson, the anvils tend to fall on the other guy. So when fate works against Darkwing, it's because he hasn't learned something. So Darkwing definitely had his ego was, 80% of the show. And the fact that the other characters, especially Gosling, called him out on it was, was a lot of fun.
So here's a silly question. If Bushroot ever did reform, would the good Negaverse version of Bushroot turn evil?
I don't know. Again, that's the two aren't necessarily exact mirror images because everybody's got a little good and evil in them. So I'd always follow the story. If someone came up with a story that said, "Hey, what if the turn around? What if we start out in the Negaverse and we see the good Bushroot turn evil? Does that mean that or turn good?" Well, I guess he was kind of good. Whatever, you could play with that, if you had a story to say it, and to almost like we have to reform the guy in the Negaverse to help out the guy in their verse. I can't even say Posiverse because in theory that was even another place.
Is there a reason we didn't see Taurus Bulba more often?
Only in that, I mean, a lot of the show was my taste. That Taurus Bulba kind of fell into the fat cat category of kind of the stock mastermind villain. So he's more of a kingpin type character as opposed to a villain that would have separate adventures. You almost expected him to have work best when he's got a mob working for him. So turning him into a cyborg was a chance to hopefully give him something more, a bigger feel. And I thought we were partially successful on that. So that's it. I mean, again, we're following entertainment, and the various villains of the Fearsome Five always seem to come back and give us. We could team them up in different ways, give them different schemes, have them stand alone, and they were, the most entertaining.
Was there ever a rematch planned with Darkwing and the cyborg Bulba? It sort of ended on a cliffhanger in that regard.
Remember I believe it was the first episode where we mowed over Bushroot, and then the last scene shows him coming back, and we made use of that. He was all through the series. It was kind of like, why kill off this guy? I mean, the story wasn't big enough in feel to warrant the death of Taurus Bulba. So it's some fans have speculated there were more plans, but generally we didn't have a whiteboard of the series mapped out. It was a whole different time. In fact, when I went and first met the DuckTales 2017 crew and was talking to them, one of the first things when a writer asked me was, "How big was your writer's room?" And I laughed. I said, "We didn't have a writer's room. Basically, people came into my office, they'd pitch something, or I'd pitch them something, or we'd go back and forth, and they'd leave the office with one or two ideas that maybe they didn't have coming in or I hadn't thought of before. And then we would let the other story editors know about new villains and things like that in case they wanted to use them. So because of that, if we were going to bring back Taurus Bulba as a cyborg, it was, hey, let's bring him back and, instead of just having a non-super villain, non-powered super villain, we haven't done anything with this kind of robotic adversary other than Gizmo Duck. So it was just to try it that way. And if somebody had pitched another story with him, we would have done it. As it was, nobody that was, toward the end of our run, or at least what we thought was going to be the end of our run. So you just leave it open.
Were there any villains who only appeared once or twice that you wish you had used more?
Not necessarily the villains. I thought, I think Carter Crocker was the writer and then story editor who made the most out of Splatter Phoenix, because he could really nail her, the way she talked and everything. It just seemed like she was different enough that I'd almost like to see her in the Fearsome Five instead of Negaduck. So we didn't always have the same dynamic when we brought those five together. She was fun. She was a different kind of a villainess. I mean, there were things. We did an episode, Twin Peaks, which was a parody of Twin Peaks, and Bushroot conveniently turned up as the body wrapped in plastic, which was featured in the Twin Peaks series. We had a character who could be dead and alive at the same time. After one of the things about that, I had one of my story editors who had never seen Twin Peaks, and he was my test because I said, this has to work for most of our audience has not seen Twin Peaks either. He loved the episode because it just felt so different to him, even at the script stage. And I said, well, this is how we came up with it. We should look for more things like that. Look for movies or, science fiction films or adventure films, whatever it is that have a special feel to it that we can play with. So we left that meeting all excited, but I have to deal with the stories that are given to me, on the desk, and nobody pitched another one of those, including, the story editor who was so excited about that. So it's not like, oh, I really want to use this villain. I can tell that to the writers and the staff writers and the story editors, and they can, if they're enthused about it, like I did with Negaduck. I mean, I literally said, I want to see more episodes of Negaduck, and we don't have to worry about why we brought him back. And somebody finally pitched a story with the Negaverse in it. That's how we developed things. It was always on the fly. It wasn't like we plotted out the story arc for the series. I mean, you can see the modern version of that mentality with DuckTales 2017, which I love that version of DuckTales. That's got a story from the beginning to the end and subplots, and they were always conscious of where they were going to go, including Darkwing Duck. And that's just modern television, whereas back then we were doing something entirely different, and with a much shorter writing schedule, by the way. So it's kind of like, oh, I'd really love to finesse this more, but it's got to go into production, and we'll try to improve it in storyboard, but now it's got to literally ship overseas. That was back in the day when we actually had to put drawings into a box and onto a boat or an airplane to take it overseas.
It's really interesting how different making a cartoon in the 90s was compared to how it is now.
Yeah, and again, a lot of, specifically Darkwing, was the comics I loved when I was a kid growing up. And this is like even pre-Marvel. I was born in 1952, and the 50s version of DC Comics were just kooky. I mean, they were Jimmy Olsen turned into a giant turtle boy. I just saw somebody posted a cover where Jimmy Olsen, of all people, is using a kryptonite laser cutter on Superman to give him a computer brain so he can fight Brainiac. It's like, really, Jimmy Olsen, Cub Reporter, is also a surgeon? But it was this crazy cover of, Superman with electronic forehead, and his chest is open and there's like a computer robot chest in there. I guess Jimmy was good with crystal radios or whatever at the time, just came up with a supercomputer. That's just insane. But, a kid was saying, wow, I got to read that story because it was a cool cover. And that's what I grew up with. It was a crazier time in comics. And that's what I wanted to do in Darkwing Duck. Nobody could write that comic story in modern day and have permission to work in a hospital or his living room, and operating on Superman. It just wouldn't even be pitched as a story. But back then it was all about these crazy covers that would get kids to pick them off the newsstand. And I used to tell the writers to basically pitch me the comic book cover. We didn't always do that, but the idea behind that was, tell me the visual idea, what's this of this episode that would be a comic book cover, because that would keep our stories visually oriented, that they weren't just talking characters, that there was some action at the center that was like, wow, did you see the one where Darkwing was split into two. And a lot of my inspiration came from old Flash comic books. And Flash was turned into an old man, a super fat character, marionette. He just went through all sorts of mutations in his covers. And it was just, that's again what I grew up with. And it was a totally different, the whiteboard was erased at the end of the episode, and nobody was changed really by what happened in that episode as soon as the next episode started. So you could worry about them overnight, and then if it was Tuesday, by Wednesday they'd be fine. Well, there are parts of me now that if I was going back now, it's like, oh no, I would still want to do, actually, the new Star Trek series, Strange New Worlds, really in their first season captured the old Star Trek feeling of one and dones. There's kind of a general continuity over the season, but most of those adventures are wrapped up in one episode. But they're very dramatic, and they're big ideas, and they're character based and all of that. If I was doing Darkwing again, much like DuckTales did when they rebooted, it would be fun to make the adventure bigger. That actually treats some of those adventure sequences a little straighter, and then maybe the comedic elements of it would then be even funnier because there'd be a contrast from the more cinematic staging and then the Warner Brothers short subject kind of anything goes cartoon aftermath. So it was like, yeah, he could be funnier, he could be more adventurous, and sometimes with Darkwing, we got very silly. I think overall, I'm very proud of the show, but it would be fun to make him more adventurous in certain elements to contrast the comedy.
I know you voiced a minor villain in one episode. Do you remember how that came about?
I don't remember it particularly, but it's been pointed out that I voiced Hammerhead, I think it was, who was in the original pilot. And that was, just for a bit of fun, or we had forgotten to cast him or whatever, or we used up the number of actors. It's like I got to do a voice in DuckTales, I got to do a voice there. At the time, it was kind of frowned upon to have creators do that. In following years, it became, you have guys running the show who do the main character of the show. So again, different time period, slightly different management. But yeah, it's rare, and maybe it's just because he had two lines and everybody else in the episode perhaps was like taken X number of voices or were characters that, no, this guy has to play these three characters because he traditionally does. Yeah, I mean, that was fun. I remember in Gummy Bears, there was Jim Magon who, co-created the show with Art Patello, but they were often ogres in the background just to talk stupid and take hits. In Aladdin, I forgot whether it was Return of Jafar or King of Thieves. It might have been King of Thieves. The writers and I, Bob Schooley and Mark McCorkle and I, did some crowd noise, just ADR, as Aladdin's throwing gold down to the peasants below. And it was like, oh, gold from the heavens, or whatever we said. And it was just Walla kind of stuff. But there was a woman there who was a paid actress who was also doing Walla. And we found out she made so much money on doing that, where we just were doing it for fun, to get it done.
Well, I'm definitely hoping to reach back out to you to talk about your work on the Aladdin sequels and series.
Yeah, and the original Aladdin was done by, people talk to me more about Darkwing, so it's very hard for me to watch any of these episodes, even the ones that are on Disney Plus, because when I watch them with a modern mentality. It's like on most Darkwing episodes, I'd like to cut like 5 minutes out of it, just tightening things up, improving the action or the comedy or the timing or whatever. One of my favorite episodes is actually the real pilot, which is that sinking feeling, which starred the villain Moriarty. That one was written to really show the writers, this is what I mean as far as mixing action and comedy. And in that episode, in the third act, everybody suddenly is wearing baseball uniforms, and we don't explain it at all, much like Bugs Bunny would do back in the day of suddenly showing up on the pitcher's mound. So because of that, and it was went to our best animation house, which was Disney Australia, which were guys who really knew short subjects, loved those old cartoons, and really captured it. And I just wish I had more episodes. By the time they were such a small studio, I think we only did 8 episodes with them. Whereas by the time Goof Troop came around, I think they did like 22 episodes. And it's just like, if we had only had that on Darkwing, the fun we would have had. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the, I know you're going through the Disney villains. Darkwing's villains was a huge part of the series going in. I wanted the classic Batman, Flash, Rogues Gallery. You know, Spider-Man is another famous one for a great Rogues Gallery of these guys who were just memorable, you know, to have fun with. They're all after this duck at the center. You know, I wanted a Rogues Gallery like that. And I think to a certain extent, we captured that. That's what we were after. So here's to Disney villains everywhere.